All right, for this mini lecture, we're going to talk about evolution. So first off, we want to define what we mean by evolution. I'm sure you've heard this term many times before, and you've heard people use the word evolved, right? That something has evolved or something has changed. So when we use the term evolution, we're referring to a change in a population over time. So we want to point out that individuals do not evolve, right? That's not what the term evolution refers to. So even though maybe in common usage you might hear about somebody being more evolved than somebody else, that's not how we use it in science. So we use the term evolution to refer to a population. So we know that within an individual, they might express a particular mutation that might be unique to them, and maybe that mutation is something that's of an advantage in their particular environment and gives them some type of advantage when it comes to avoiding prey or finding a mate, and therefore they get to reproduce and pass on that characteristic to the next generation. So when we talk about evolution, we're talking about changes, and these changes are at the level of the DNA. So it has to be something that can be passed on from one individual to the next. And we're talking about these changes spreading through a population. So it's not just one individual, it's something that we've seen that has kind of persisted and is now in many individuals within a population. Okay, so we're talking about a change, and it says in inherited characteristics of a group of organisms, meaning a population, because they all belong to the same species usually. And this is occurring not through one generation, but over many, many generations. Okay, but ultimately, where all this starts is with a mutation. All right, so kind of our ultimate source of genetic change is a mutation that pops up at the level of the DNA. And we've talked about the different types of mutations that can occur, right? We talked about base pair substitutions and insertions and deletions. So those little tiny things that happen when DNA is being replicated, and those little things change a protein or change an enzyme. So it can change how something functions, or it can change the phenotype. So those little tiny things are really what it all kind of boils down to when we're talking about evolution. Now, we use the term natural selection a lot of times in combination with evolution. And we say that natural selection is kind of the driving force behind evolution. That this is a process, okay? So it says it's a process by which individuals with advantageous inherited characteristics for that particular environment, they get to survive, right? So we already kind of mentioned that those who have a certain trait or a certain characteristic that's deemed to be kind of healthy or of a benefit in a particular environment, and it may not be advantageous in a different environment, right? If the environment changes, it may be something that doesn't work. So once again, this is something that allows them to be better camouflaged within their particular environment, allows them to outrun a predator, allows them to find food sources, or even lets them attract a mate much more easily. So whatever these characteristics are, they survive, they reproduce, and because they're reproducing, they're passing on these successful characteristics to the next generation. And we find these traits at a higher percentage in the next generation because they've been successful. They had a lot of offspring. Maybe they've had multiple opportunities to produce offspring. And so we see these characteristics then spreading through the population. Right? So I always think of natural selection as kind of reproductive success. All right, those who are more successful within a particular environment are the ones that get to reproduce. Those who are not so successful are the ones who don't reproduce and therefore tend not to spread their characteristics on to the next generation. Okay, so natural selection happens in nature when individuals with traits that are better suited to their environment, they survive and they reproduce, and they reproduce more successfully than others. And over many generations, these advantageous traits become much more common in the population. So you see there in the slide, whoever has the most kids wins, right? So whoever has the most offspring that they've passed those characteristics on, that's the characteristics we're going to see in the population. Okay, and one of the best or well-known examples of natural selection is the case of the peppered moth. So if you've never heard of this, it's a perfect example of natural selection at work. So we have images of peppered moths. On the left-hand side, we have a light-colored, a medium-colored, and a dark-colored peppered moth that is on tree bark. So during the Industrial Revolution in England, most of the peppered moths were of a light colored. They had light colored wings, the little speckling that you see there, and that helped them to blend in with the pale bark of the trees that they would like to rest on. So the bark of the trees is usually covered in lichens. That's kind of the green stuff that you see in the background, and that's what caused them to be a little bit lighter in color. And so because they were blending in and they were camouflaged against the tree bark, that protected them from predators such as birds that like to swoop down and kind of gobble these guys up. Now, if you're of a dark color, you stand out a lot more against this light-colored background. So early on, the light-colored peppered moth was at an advantage in this particular environment. The light-colored moths were the ones that got to reproduce and pass on their characteristics, and so the population started to become much more lighter in color. Then during the Industrial Revolution, what happened is a lot of factories started to release a lot of soot and pollution into the air, and the lichens started to die off, and the trees became a lot darker from the soot being deposited onto the bark. And the next thing you know, these light-colored moths that were so prevalent before started to be easily seen because they were no longer camouflaged. So the birds started to eat the light-colored moths, whereas any of the darker colored moths that were left that survived, they are the ones that now started to become a lot more camouflaged. So because the environment changed, the characteristic that was favorable also changed. So over time, the population shifted, so there were more dark-colored moths that were far more common than the light-colored ones. So this is an example of evolution through natural selection. All right, we said that's a process when individuals with traits that are better suited to their environment survive. So the environment changed, and we see that those traits that were selected for changed. Now later, when the pollution level started to decrease and all kinds of laws went into place to monitor how much pollution was released by factories, the trees started to lighten up again, and then it swung back to the lighter colored moths. So they regained their advantage. And once again, just kind of demonstrates how environmental changes can directly influence which traits are favored in a population. Now, in contrast to natural selection, we have what's called artificial selection. And this occurs when humans intentionally breed organisms for specific traits that they find desirable. So this is humans that are doing the selecting, not the environment at all. So this process doesn't necessarily improve an organism's survival in the wild, but it just kind of meets the human needs, right? It meets our needs or our preferences. So for instance, and your book talks about this, humans have selectively bred dogs for traits such as the size. Sometimes we like dogs to be little tiny and can fit in a teacup, right? Little teacup ones. Or sometimes we like them bigger. Sometimes we like them fluffier. Sometimes we like them so they don't trigger any allergies. So we've bred them for different coat colors and for behavior. And it's not just dogs. We've bred a lot of other animals. We breed cows so that they produce more milk. We breed flowers so that they have more petals, or they have a better scent, or they have different colors. So this is all artificial selection. Okay, so this is when humans step in and we are the ones making the decisions about who gets to reproduce and which characteristics are deemed to be desirable. So this is just showing from your book all the different dog breeds that we have today, right? All the different traits that we were looking for over time and the wide variety that has ensued because of us selecting for different things within the dog population, right? Different characteristics. All right, so let's talk about adaptation. All right, so it says a population can evolve via natural selection so that more individuals have beneficial traits and fewer have disadvantaged traits. So adaptation, it says, is the process by which a population becomes better matched to its environment over time. And this is through natural selection. All right, so the characteristics that help an organism survive and reproduce within that particular environment. So we're looking at those traits, those adaptations. So adaptations, once again, develop over many generations through the process of natural selection. So individuals with advantageous traits are more likely to survive. They're more likely to pass on those traits to their offspring. So an adaptation can be structural. So it could be something such as having very thick fur for polar bears, and that helps to insulate them from the cold. It could be behavioral, like birds migrating to warmer climates during the winter. It could be physiological, such as desert plants being able to conserve more water, right? So these traits increase the organism's fitness or its ability to live and reproduce and ensure that its genes continue into the future generations. All right, so in this way, adaptations are kind of key to how species evolve and how they thrive in changing environments. All right, so we have a question here. Compare and contrast artificial and natural selection. Name two ways in which they are similar and how are they different? So you can stop the recording here and see if you can answer that question. All right, so artificial selection and natural selection, right? Artificial selection is when humans do the selection, right? We are selecting which particular traits are deemed essential, whereas in natural selection, that occurs because there's a particular trait that is of an advantage in that particular environment. All right, so two ways in which they're similar. So we are looking at them both being able to pass on characteristics, right? So it has to be characteristics that can be inherited or passed on to the next generation. And we're looking at that change that occurs in a population over time. Okay, so we're still looking at it occurring over long periods of time. All right, we've got an iClicker question. So which of the following illustrates evolution by natural selection? So once again, you can stop the recording and read through the different answers and choose one before I give it all away. All right, so for this one, it says, Shonda grew up in a hot climate of Louisiana. 5 years ago, she moved to Colorado and has gotten used to the weather. So that's not it. That's just Shonda acclimating. B, we have many people living in high altitude, oxygen poor regions of Tibet. They have a gene mutation that increases their blood oxygen supply. So we're talking about something at the level of the DNA, and we're talking about a population. All right, so natural selection, all right, we're looking at individuals that have successful characteristics and passing